June 6, 1944, 0630 hours, Omaha Beach. The water turns red even before touching the sand. The German machine gunner Franz Gockel watches American soldiers die in rows. He is methodical, mechanical. He is no longer aiming. He just moves the weapon from side to side. The MG-42 machine gun does the rest. Later, in a never-sent letter, he would write something that seemed to make no sense in that moment of chaos. They came at us with American courage and British cunning. American courage, British cunning. That exact phrase appears in 17 separate German reports after the action in Normandy. Not 16, not 18, 17. Every officer struggling to explain the same impossible contradiction. How the Americans they were killing had somehow executed a plan far beyond the known American strategic capacity at the time. Here's what everyone knows about D-Day. Eisenhower commanded. American soldiers took Omaha Beach. America's industrial power won the largest amphibious invasion in history, defining the moment of United States military supremacy. But here's what German intelligence already knew on June 7, 1944. Every major strategic element of Operation Overlord, the deception, the planning, the technology, the logistics, everything had been designed, built, and orchestrated by British minds operating from a bunker beneath London. This is not historical revision. This is German military assessment made in the heat of battle. And if you think D-Day was a purely American operation, you've been watching the wrong documentary for 80 years. The narrative was altered, the credits were transferred, and the truth was buried under decades of blockbuster movies and patriotism. Let me show you exactly how complete this erasure was and who the true architect was that history forgot. Let's look at Saving Private Ryan. 24 minutes of Omaha Beach, Spielberg's masterpiece, 3 hours long. What we see are American flags, American sacrifice, American generals. What you don't see is not a single frame showing the British officers who spent 18 months designing every element of what those soldiers were trying to do. The Longest Day, released in 1962. 42 speaking roles. Exactly 0 scenes in the Cossack bunker where the invasion was actually planned. Band of Brothers. 10 acclaimed episodes. The planning? A 30-second montage of Eisenhower pointing at maps. This was not oversight. This was systematic narrative construction, and the Germans immediately noticed the discrepancy between the story told and the reality of the battlefield. Major General Wilhelm Richter, defending Sword Beach, wrote in his post-invasion analysis that the attack was unmistakably British in concept, with layered deception, specialized technology, and methodical timing, but the force was predominantly American in composition. Think about that phrase for a moment. Unmistakably British in concept. A German general, under interrogation, trying to explain to his captors why the invasion worked. He doesn't say it was American planning executed by Americans. He says American forces executed a British plan. But here's where the story gets deeper. The man who planned D-Day, designed the landing zones, calculated the tides, selected the June 5th to 7th window, and organized the deception operations was British Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan. His title was Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, designated by the acronym COSAC. He got this job in March of 1943. Eisenhower? Eisenhower arrived in January of 1944, 9 months later. The plan was already complete. Morgan worked from a complex of bunkers beneath Norfolk House in London. 1,200 officers, the vast majority British, planned everything. Beach gradients, tide tables, drop zones, supply schedules. Eisenhower merely expanded the plan from 3 divisions to 5. That's all. The concept, the beaches, the technology, it was all pure Morgan, pure British. I will now prove this with 3 specific examples of how the British mind designed every step the Americans took and how Eisenhower changed almost nothing. German General Gunther Blumentritt testified after the war that they expected an invasion, but they did not expect such Byzantine complexity. Byzantine complexity. That was the exact phrase he used. Only British intelligence, with its centuries-old tradition of espionage and global strategy, was capable of weaving such an intricate web. Let me show you 3 practical examples that prove this. First, the beach selection. General Morgan's team did not choose a random spot on the map. They analyzed every inch of coastline from Cherbourg to Antwerp. They chose Normandy not because it was the closest point to England, but because it was the most defensible point after the landing. The terrain allowed for rapid expansion for the Allied troops, but there was a crucial detail: the bocage, the hedgerow country. Those ancient, dense hedgerows that cut across the French landscape. Morgan knew that the bocage would slow down German armored counterattacks. This was pure British strategic thinking. They didn't just plan the landing on the sand, they planned how to survive in the critical 48 hours after it. Example 2. The timing. June 5th, 6th, and 7th. Why these specific dates? Because for an invasion to work, you need an almost impossible combination of natural factors. You need spring tides to have the maximum landing area. You need moonlight so that the paratrooper operations on the previous night have visibility. And you need H-hour, the moment of attack, to happen at low tide to expose the obstacles and mines that Rommel placed in the water. This combination of moon, high tide, and low tide occurs exactly 3 days a month. Morgan's team calculated this mathematically in 1943. They delivered a ready calendar to Eisenhower. The American general did not guess the date. He chose a day based on British mathematics. Before we move on to the third example, which is the most shocking of all, I want you to do something. If you are now realizing that the history you learned in school was incomplete, write the phrase "the truth matters" in the comments below. I want to see how many of us are truly paying attention. And now, look at the red subscribe button below this video. Most people will ignore this and continue living in comfortable ignorance, but only the chosen ones, those who have the courage to question the official narrative and seek the deeper truth, will click that red button now. Join the elite who know the real history. Example 3. The deception. The plan to convince Hitler that the invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais and not Normandy was entirely British. The 20 Committee, or Double Cross, controlled every German spy on British soil. Not most of them, all of them. And they fed them a completely fictitious invasion plan. German records recovered after the war show that this worked perfectly. General Alfred Jodel's diary, one of Hitler's closest men, states verbatim that Normandy appeared to be merely a diversion. They believed the British lie because it was told with perfection. If you think the intellectual planning was impressive, wait until you see the physical engineering. What I'm about to reveal next changes everything about how you visualize the battle. The Germans looked out at the sea and saw metal monsters approaching. They called them swimming tanks, something that, according to the laws of physics they knew, should not exist. June 6, 1944, 07:45 hours. Gold Beach. Captain Wilhelm Hartung observes something emerging from the ocean that shouldn't exist. A 30-ton Churchill tank. But something is wrong. It's swimming. The captain sees a canvas screen around the hull, keeping the water out while the tracks spin propellers at the rear. The metal monster reaches the sand. The screen lowers in seconds and the cannon fires. 30 seconds from water to full combat effectiveness. Hartung's subsequent report is a document of pure shock. The enemy has deployed swimming panzers of unknown and extremely effective design. The Germans didn't have a word for what they were seeing because they had never conceived of it. They believed tanks required landing craft, large, slow targets that their artillery could easily destroy. But the DD tank duplex drive changed the game. It was designed by British engineer Nicholas Straussler and refined by the 79th British Armored Division. The Americans used some at Omaha, but the concept, design, and testing were entirely British. But the swimming tanks were just the beginning. Did you know that most of the technology that cleared the beaches that day would have seemed straight out of a science fiction movie by 1944 standards? Let me show you the full list of British innovations that German soldiers faced with horror. They were called Hobart's Funnies, named after Major General Percy Hobart, a British armored commander so eccentric and brilliant that he was forced to retire before the war, only to be personally brought back by Churchill. Hobart created mechanical monsters for specific problems. There were the crab tanks, equipped with a rotating flail at the front that spun heavy chains, beating the ground and detonating mines before they could explode the tank. There were the crocodile tanks, armored flamethrowers with a terrifying range of 110 meters, capable of clearing entire bunkers without a single infantry soldier needing to expose themselves. And there were the bobbin tanks, which unrolled reinforced canvas mats over soft sand to create an instant road, preventing heavy vehicles coming behind from getting stuck. 5 types of specialized armor. all British, all deployed on D-Day. Here is the German perspective from Colonel Eduard Bader of the 352nd Artillery Regiment. He wrote, "The British beaches displayed specialized equipment we had never encountered. They overcame obstacles in minutes that, by our calculations, should have taken hours for traditional combat engineering to traverse. Minutes that should have taken hours." That is the sound of British engineering defeating German fortifications, not with extra blood, but with extra brain. Now stop and think for a second. Why have you never seen a crab tank or a crocodile in movies like Saving Private Ryan? Why does Hollywood show soldiers dying to blow up walls with manual explosives when the technology to do so mechanically already existed and was present? The answer is simple: because these funnies were British. Showing British technological superiority doesn't fit the narrative of the improvising American hero. But the tanks were only what the Germans could see on the beach. What they couldn't see, what was coming behind the first wave, was a seaborne infrastructure that defied geography itself. That was what truly broke the minds of the German engineers when they finally grasped what was happening. Imagine arriving on the coast of a hostile continent with 150,000 men, thousands of vehicles, and tons of ammunition, knowing a brutal truth: you have nowhere to unload any of it. Lieutenant General Morgan's planners knew they couldn't capture an intact French port. Cherbourg and Le Havre were fortified, and at the first sign of invasion, the Germans would blow up the docks, cranes, and breakwaters. Without a port, the invasion would starve and run out of ammunition in less than a week. The American solution would be to try to capture a port faster. The British solution was something bordering on insanity for the time. If we can't capture a port, we'll bring one with us. Thus the Mulberry Harbors were born. They weren't just improvised floating bridges. They were entire port cities, prefabricated in England and towed across the English Channel under the nose of the Luftwaffe. We're talking about an industrial scale that defies comprehension. 600,000 tons of concrete were used to create the Phoenix caissons. These were concrete boxes the size of 5-story buildings, hollow inside to float, which were towed across the sea and then sunk into precise positions to create artificial deep-water breakwaters. Inside this artificial harbor, British engineers designed the floating roadways called whales. These were miles of steel tracks mounted on concrete floats that rose and fell with the tide. Remember, the tide in Normandy varies by more than 6 meters. A fixed pier would have been useless. British engineering created a harbor that breathed with the ocean. 2 harbors were built: Mulberry A for the Americans at Omaha and Mulberry B for the British at Gold. A storm destroyed the American harbor on June 19th, but the British harbor, due to more secure anchoring and constant maintenance, survived. It landed 40% of all Allied supplies in Europe over the next 6 months. Major General Wilhelm Richter, the man tasked with defending the coast, was in absolute disbelief. He wrote in his report that the British had produced an artificial harbor of such technical sophistication that they had not imagined possible. German engineering, which prided itself on being the best in the world in 1944, with its V-2 rockets and jet engines, could not conceive of the raw, ingenious logistics that British civil engineers had executed at sea. And there was Pluto, the acronym for Pipeline Under the Ocean. Modern armies don't march, they drive. Tanks, trucks, and jeeps guzzle fuel in astronomical quantities. Oil tankers are slow, easy, and explosive targets for German submarines. The British solution? Unspooling a giant flexible pipe, like a fishing line from a reel, from the bottom of a ship, connecting the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg. British engineers laid 130 kilometers of piping on the seabed. The Americans used the fuel. The British built the tap. All this technology, the swimming tanks, the floating harbors, the underwater pipelines, ensured the invasion could sustain itself physically. But none of it would matter if the German army was waiting on the right beach. And this is where the story stops being about concrete and steel engineering and starts being about the engineering of the human mind. Let's look at the deception operations that made all this viable. May 1944, Pas-de-Calais, France. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, Germany's most respected commander, is on a beach looking at the horizon. He is 240 kilometers from where the invasion will actually take place. And yet he is absolutely certain, with an unshakable conviction, that it is precisely there, in Pas-de-Calais, that the Allies will land. He concentrated his best armored divisions there. He built his heaviest fortifications there. He is wrong. Completely, disastrously wrong. But the reason a military genius like Rommel is looking at the wrong beach isn't incompetence. It's because British intelligence spent 18 months meticulously ensuring he was wrong. Rommel was seeing what he wanted to see, because an invisible network was feeding his fears with perfectly constructed lies. Operation Fortitude wasn't just a magic trick. It was total control of the enemy's reality. Rommel was doomed to lose that battle before the first shot, because we controlled not most, but absolutely all German spies on British soil. Here is the exact picture of what the German High Command believed on the night of June 5th. They were certain the main invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. They believed this massive force would be commanded by the legendary General George Patton, the man the Germans feared most. And they believed Patton was leading the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, a colossal force of 11 divisions stationed in southeast England ready to attack. Every word of that belief was fiction, pure British fiction. FUSAG did not exist. Patton was commanding nothing but a ghost army. There were no 11 divisions waiting in Dover. There were just empty fields and a few tents. But the Germans believed it with a religious, absolutely unshakable faith, because the British counterintelligence system, the most sophisticated in history, made them believe. This was the double-cross system. The crown jewel of this system was a man codenamed Garbo. His real name was Juan Pujol Garcia, an eccentric Spanish citizen who hated fascism with such intensity that he volunteered his services to the British. Controlled by his MI5 handler, Tomas Harris, Garbo created an entire network of 27 fictional subagents. He invented their personalities, their lives, their reports. Garbo sent 315 detailed letters to German intelligence between 1942 and 1944. All were fiction. All were believed and paid for by the Germans. The most critical moment of this lie occurred on June 9th, 3 days after D-Day. The Allies were already in France, fighting to expand the beachhead. Hitler was beginning to waver, thinking of moving his reserves from Pas-de-Calais to Normandy to crush the invasion. At this moment of supreme danger, Garbo sent an urgent message to Berlin. He said, "Do not move the troops. Normandy is a diversion, a trap to lure your reserves. The real attack, led by Patton, will come at Pas-de-Calais at any moment." Berlin believed him. They kept 15 elite armored divisions stalled in Pas-de-Calais, 200 kilometers from the real battle, until the end of July. Think about that. The fate of Europe was decided because the German High Command trusted the word of a British-controlled double agent more than the reports of their own field commanders who were seeing the Americans right in front of them. General Alfred Jodl later testified that Garbo's intelligence was classified as of the highest reliability. But Garbo was just the tip of the spear. There was the phantom radio traffic, where British operators transmitted fake orders to armies that didn't exist, knowing the Germans were listening. There were the inflatable tanks and plywood planes, positioned where Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes could photograph them. There was the controlled leaking of diplomatic information. British intelligence not only deceived the enemy, it paralyzed the German mobile reserve. 156,000 Allied soldiers landed in Normandy and fought for their lives. Meanwhile, 450,000 German soldiers, almost 500,000 well-equipped men, stood idle in northern France, looking at the empty sea, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The deception was an absolute success. It saved tens of thousands of American lives. But the credit for this success was stolen by history. The popular narrative forgot the spies of London and focused only on the soldiers of Omaha. Now, let's leave the battlefield and enter a colder, more revealing place. Let's go to the Nuremberg interrogation room, where the propaganda cameras have already been turned off, and listen to what the defeated generals, the men who lost everything, said when they could finally speak the truth about who truly defeated them. Nuremberg, 1945. We are inside the Allied interrogation rooms. The war is over. The Third Reich is in ruins. The German generals, those who survived, no longer have a reason to lie. There is no longer a Führer to please, no more propaganda to uphold. They are exhausted, defeated, and merely trying to explain to military historians what truly happened. And when they talk about D-Day, the greatest defeat they suffered, they don't talk about America. They talk repeatedly about Great Britain. Listen carefully to the testimony of General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff of the OKW. The American interrogator, expecting praise for his own country's strategy, asks, "What surprised you most about the invasion?" Jodl's answer is direct and without hesitation: the meticulousness of the British planning. Every element, from intelligence to logistics, functioned with a clockwork precision we did not expect from a combined operation. He didn't say Allied planning, he didn't say American planning, he was specific, British planning. Major General Walter Warlimont, Jodl's deputy, went even further in his technical analysis. He told his captors that the invasion bore British hallmarks everywhere: the strategic deception, the technical innovation, the timing of the tides. The American execution was brave, he admitted, but it was clearly following a British master design. To Warlimont, the American soldiers were the actors, but the script and direction were unmistakably from London. But the most devastating assessment, the one that should be taught in every military school, comes from General Hans Speidel. He was Rommel's chief of staff, the man who tried to defend the beaches. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote a sentence that summarizes everything we've discussed here. "We prepared to fight Americans and their reliance on materiel. Instead, we encountered British strategic planning combined with American material strength." Against that specific combination, Germany had no answer. Germany had no answer for the British brain guiding the American muscle. Frederick Morgan, Percy Hobart, John Bevan, Bertram Ramsay. These men deserved monuments in Washington and London. They deserved multi-million-dollar budget films telling their stories of genius. Instead, they earned footnotes in academic books that nobody reads. The American public never knew their names because American culture told American stories to American audiences. Hollywood needed a hero and made Eisenhower the solitary architect of victory, erasing Morgan and his team of 1,200 officers. It was such a complete transfer of credit that it became the accepted truth. But the Germans, the professionals who were on the other side of the front line, knew the difference. They felt the difference in their bones. Now, you might be thinking that D-Day was an exception, an isolated case of collaboration where roles became blurred. But I am here to tell you it wasn't. D-Day was not an accident. It was a repeated pattern throughout the entire war in Europe. There are 4 more major military operations where America took eternal fame for a plan that Great Britain quietly designed behind the scenes. What I am about to reveal next will show that the history of World War II, is in fact only half the story. D-Day was not an isolated anomaly. It was the operational pattern of the entire war in the West. If you look at the map of Allied victory, you'll see the same signature at almost every turning point. Operation Torch in North Africa, the first major joint offensive. The narrative says it was Eisenhower's debut. The reality from the archives shows it was executed by Americans, but meticulously planned by the British Admiralty and Combined Operations Headquarters. Look at Operation Husky in Sicily. Popular history remembers General Patton racing across the island with his tanks, a demonstration of pure American aggression. But who designed the invasion? Who coordinated the naval and aerial logistics that allowed Patton to put his tanks ashore? It was British General Harold Alexander and his team. Patton commanded the stage, but Alexander wrote the play. Look at the Rhine crossing, Operation Plunder, the final blow to the heart of Germany. American muscle, British brain. The pattern is absolute and undeniable. Operations that relied on British strategic planning succeeded with calculated losses. Now compare that to operations where the planning was purely American, where tactical impatience overcame methodical strategy. Look at the Hurtgen Forest. Without British subtlety, without deception, without integrated signals intelligence, it became a predictable and brutal bloodbath, where soldiers' courage was wasted against obvious defensive positions. The Germans, who were the harshest judges on the battlefield, could see the difference clearly. They knew which operations bore the British signature and which did not. They feared British cunning as much as they feared American firepower. When the two were together, defeat was inevitable. When they were separate, Germany still had a chance. Let's go back to the final moment of this story. June 6, 1944, 10 p.m. The sun has finally set over Normandy. At headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, sits in silence. The man who was idolized as the master of mobile warfare, who built the Atlantic Wall, knows it is all over. His greatest defensive network, built with years of slave labor and German engineering, was not just penetrated, but completely breached in just 14 hours. He picks up his pen and writes a sentence in his diary that should echo through history. The enemy executed a plan of extraordinary completeness. Think of the weight of those words coming from an enemy. Extraordinary completeness. He didn't speak of overwhelming numbers. He didn't speak of luck. He spoke of a plan that left no gaps, that anticipated his every move, that paralyzed his reserves and neutralized his advantages. Rommel fought the British in the desert for 2 years. He knew the mind of his opponent. That night, he knew he had been defeated by the same mind, now amplified by American industry. I want to be very clear here, because it's easy to misinterpret this historical correction. Courage was absolutely American. The blood that stained Omaha Beach water red was American blood. The sons who didn't come home to Ohio, New York, and Texas gave the ultimate measure of devotion. No one, absolutely no one, diminishes what those soldiers did by jumping into icy water under machine gun fire. But courage without planning is just death. Courage without the intelligence to direct it is just tragedy. What British planning did was transform American courage into victory. They ensured the sacrifice was not in vain. They ensured that when the soldiers climbed the hill, the tanks would be there to support them. The port would be there to feed them, and the German reinforcements would be 200 kilometers away, chasing ghosts. The partnership won the war. The British mind and the American fist. But in the decades that followed, one of the partners told all the stories and took all the credit. Here is your choice today. You can keep believing the Hollywood version, where American generals solve everything with bravado and inspiring speeches. It's a comfortable story, it's a simple story. Or you can believe the enemy. You can believe the men who actually fought against the plan, the German generals who lost their careers and their wars, and who, in their final moments of honesty, credited the nation that truly designed their defeat, Great Britain. I want to know what you think. Did you know about General Morgan? Did you know about the spies of Committee 20 or Hobart's funnies? Or is this the first time you're hearing that D-Day was a British design? Leave a comment below. History has been rewritten, but we can correct it one fact at a time. If this video has changed the way you see World War II, if it has given you a new perspective on the truth behind the myth, then do your part. Subscribe to the channel now. Like this video so the algorithm shows the truth to more people. There are 40 more operations where official history hid the true architects, and we will reveal each of them. The truth is not in the movies you watched in the cinema. It is in the forgotten testimonies of the men who lost the war.